thanking the organizers for making this possible and for all of you for being here. It is a pleasure to speak to you about religious experience and photography. The subtitle of my paper is Towards the Phenomenology of Religious Imagination. I believe there are some, I printed some copies for those of you who would prefer to have or to follow this presentation while I read it. Maybe you can help me pass them. Thank you. In the interest of making this presentation compact so that we have time to discuss, I will only read what is in big print. The small print, I will reserve that for further reference. Okay. I may well worship an image, a painting, a statue, but a photograph? With this quote and question, Roland Barthes wants to settle an issue that is not quite as clear for the religious believer, who prays with depicted images. Within Christianity, God is transcendent to the world and belongs to an altogether different order from perception. Photography, by remaining faithful to what was once perceivable and by representing it without symbolization, seems furthest removed from representing the religious. And yet, at least for the Christian, God is not prevented by his transcendence from acting tangibly in the visible world, for the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. End quote. The good news of the incarnation returns yet again in the church and in the sacraments, whose visible signs for invisible realities, and especially the Eucharist, are what they signify. Why then would photographs be prevented from giving testimony to the divine agency in the here and now? One answer to this question is that, at least in Christianity, photography runs counter to the grain of accepted iconography practices and their theological and metaphysical commitments. One could also say that a divine subject is nowhere constrained to appear in a photograph the way perceived things do. Divine manifestation, whether in word or in image, is itself a divinely given gift and not a man-made imposition. As a phenomenologist, however, I want to address the possibility of a religious photography, focusing on the kind of appearing photographs bear on their subject. Moreover, I believe this question is valuable as it brings to the fore some of the necessary determinations of the play of imagination in one who prays with images. Moreover, the finding of the contours of the religious play of imagination is important because there is a history of not properly acknowledging them in the practice of praying with images. Intellectualists, both early and recent, have suspected of iconophilic believers that they are deluded. But already Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his critique of James Fraser's Golden Bough, pointed out that no one paying an act of piety to an image crudely confuses the image with what it represents. At the heart of praying with images, there is at least a conscious distinction between an image and its subject. However, I will argue through the case of a minimal photography of the religious that there has to be more to this depicted play of the imagination in the believer's mind. In fact, her imagination must also play a metaphoric role in connecting the image and its subject. Okay. So the first section of my paper, it's about the depicted play of imagination. And so in the order of things, I propose to follow Edmund Husserl's description of both depicted images and the role of imagination that generally corresponds. Okay. Husserl understands both imagination, or fantasy, and image consciousness, Bewusstsein, as modifications of perception. Perception is indeed originary consciousness and ranks as an act of presentification, Gegenwärtigung, because perception directly and intuitively presents a thing in space as corporeally, like haptic, before or perceptual regard. In contrast, our conscious rapport with images, as well as our acts of memory and pure fantasy, rank as representifications or Vergegenwärtigungen. The latter name is fitting, since the latter acts do entail a double presence. Consider, for example, depictions such as a family portrait, a devotional image, and a Byzantine icon. I had one in my presentation, but realizing that we have such a magnificent piece, I thought better to deal with the things themselves first. Might be a little bit of a problem with the focus. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. So that's us in Gamming, Austria. While these images are found within my perceptual field of regard, what appears in them does not appear as presently before me. The depicted objectivities appear not directly, but through something else that is present, in a way analogous to signs and symbols, but with the difference that the image already offers an intuition of what is intended in them. So in our encounters with images, with depictions, one thus distinguishes between the presentation of an image object, such as the photographic image, such the devotional portrait, the religious icon. And second, the subject of that depiction, i.e. the photograph family of four, Saint Philomena, or in this case, the resurrection. Whoso further distinguishes both the object and the subject of an image from the underlying image thing, such as the photographic paper with stains or the gilded wooden tablet that trigger my consciousness of an image. Okay? This is the very basic structure of depictive image consciousness. Now, while this image thing appears as perceptually present, so the wooden tablet, it appears in an inhibited way. I do not quite see the cardboard paper and ink blots as such, unless I look contrary to the intentions of the artist, for example, as when I place the image upside down, or else come too close to the picture, visually attaining the equivalent of excessively zooming in and seeing a picture pixelate. Maybe some of you remember in this connection an image from, what movie is that?
Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
Ferris
Bueller, excuse me.
Yes. Where they skip school for, amongst others, paying a visit to the Art Institute of Chicago, and they're beholding a pointillistic painting, I believe, by Seurat. At first blush, they look at the painting and they can see the face. One of the characters here, Cameron, I think, looks at the painting and sees the face of a baby, but when he looks at it a little bit closer, he just sees dots, and the image has been lost, and he's bewildered. Okay. Husserl would account for that in terms of losing awareness of the image and facing just the thing, the physical support to the image. Okay, but while I'm looking at the image, the appearance is indeed inhibited. As I perceive the image thing, my imagination takes up the sensuous contents of that perceptual appearance and fantasizes in, or hineinfantasieren, the image object. Thus, the image object appears within the perceptual field of regard by taking up actual sensuous contents. But since the image object is fantasized into, I never take it as something merely perceived. Rather, I take the image as wholly exhibiting something else. The photographic image here depicts my family, Saint Philomena, in this case, the resurrection, and so on. Now, it is worth noting that the image object can only exhibit a subject to a degree to which the appearing image resembles the originary perceiving of an object. By way of resemblance, the consciousness of the intended object, and this is a quote from Husserl, the consciousness of the intended object lives in the kindred traits of the image, end quote. The image subject does not appear at all by itself and apart from the image, unless one no longer looks at an image as such, but simply daydreams about it. No, rather one sees the subject in the image, hinein. Since the subject appears in a borrowed, proximate appearance, rather than in its own originary appearance, the subject appears unmistakably as absent. So Husserl does labor the point of the appearance of both the image object and the image subject, because he's all along interested in distinguishing depicted image consciousness from the case of an illusory perception. The confusion of the two has been, of course, an issue going as far back as Plato, whereas for Husserl, clearly there is a difference between an illusory perception and an encounter with an image. Okay, now I want to move on to the photographic play of imagination in the second part of my paper. The triadic structure of image consciousness, comprising image object, subject, and image thing, can now help us understand the exceptionality of photography from a phenomenological standpoint. In photographs, one distinguishes between image object and subject, but unlike in painting, it is more difficult in a photograph to attend to the image object apart from the image subject. It is, to quote Roland Barthes, as if the photograph always carries its referent with itself. And again, a photograph is always invisible. It is not it that we see. We always see the subject, the referent. In turn, Barthes calls the image subject a spectrum, since the photographed person appears to pose, that is, imitate herself. In doing so, for Barthes, the portrait sitter unwittingly undergoes a rehearsal of death, as is subjectivity playing the part of an objectivity. Okay? So, just an example that I thought in relation to this is an image by Horst P. Horst of the actress Jessica Tandy. But this is, of course, true of every photograph for which I'm asked to pose. I feel, according to Barthes, that from within I have to lend myself as an object, and that even in the hearing of the clicking, says Barthes, it's almost as if a nail was being put on a coffin. There is a strange rehearsal of death in taking photographs. The photographer is very busy trying to make you look alive, right? Yeah. Why is that? He says, well, there's a story about death going on in photography. Okay, a photograph does not just represent a subject, it also indexes or certifies that something real existed before the camera for the reflected light to impress the chemically coated film or digital sensor. And while it usually takes a person to set up the camera before an object and then select the photograph, the process itself of photography occurs under predetermined parameters without the interference of the subjectivity of the artist. Hence, photography only captures what is present or in the present simultaneous to the photograph. One cannot photograph the past or the future. But as the photograph is taken, the photograph presence becomes an index for a past presence. Furthermore, the photograph past appears so certain that it cannot be improved upon, tinkered, or relieved with the plasticity of memory. So, as Barthes puts it, the photograph is neither image nor reality, but in your being, really, a reality one can no longer touch. This isolation and unrepeatability of the photograph is further emphasized by the fact that, unlike a remembered past, photography conveys just the past moment without my awareness of having perceived what appears photographically. An undated photograph certifies that the past thing existed, but it does not just tell me how long ago. Okay. Now, according to the American phenomenologist John Groff, the play of imagination, particularly on the level of fantasying the image subject, becomes so constrained to the real world and so specific to the mundanely visible that photographs inevitably foil both our awareness of something fictive and our awareness of the religious. One could read, for example, a children's book with photographs of people dressed up. Yes? From Amazing or Fantastic Mr. Fox. Instead of having drawn characters, but the overall fictive experience would be spoiled by the inevitable intentions about the real persons themselves. Okay, so for John Groff, when I look at photographs, I'm still attending to who these people really are, and I take them as disguised in a certain way, whereas when I simply read a story without any photographs being involved, my intentionality goes straight forward to the fictive things that I deal with. Similarly, when looking at photographic stills for a play or movie, our recognition of the characters is toned down by the awareness of the real actors. They do not yet appear concealed by the enveloping narrative of the play or the movie. Let me see, perhaps I have an image for that. Yes, a couple actually. So the first is a still from the life of the Passion of St. Joan of Arc. It's a 1928 movie, I think, with Maria Fanconelli. It's a very powerful movie, and its stills also have some poignancy. The movie has no words. We don't have the sound registry for the movie, but as an enveloping story employing many images, it can capture our imagination. But for Groff, when you just look at a still or at an image, you are more tempted to see just the actor or the actress rather than the character. And I thought of illustrating this point also with a picture of Saint Therese of Lisieux performing the Passion of St. Joan of Arc for her Carmelite sisters. When I look at that image of Saint Therese, I cannot see her fully concealed by the role of St. Joan of Arc. And this because of the very process of photography that isolates only one moment. Okay. With regards to our religious subject, photography not only struggles with the temporally or ontological inaccessibility of religious figures, even if nothing prevents as an ideal possibility that Jesus Christ or the Blessed Virgin Mary could have been photographed. More decisively, for Groff, photography with its adherence to a past reality closes the space, quote, the space between the image and its religious subject for the play of imagination, which is an essential ingredient of religious experience. End quote. Now, as I will show in a moment, I will partly agree with Groff that photography is not as ideally suited to represent the religious as in the other sacred arts. However, photography's capacity to convey the worldly and all that has been is not absolute or total, but has limits. Indeed, the photograph's reality effect is first at all possible because of the necessary distinction between the image subject and the image object. That distinction, of course, still holds. The question that we must now consider then is whether the distinction or distance between image object and subject in photography is on the whole constant, or whether there are some cases where it takes more than just resemblance to see a certain subject in an image. Okay, so now I move on to the core question: can the religious be photographed? Without further ado, let me address at least 3 ways in which something religious may be said to come into contact with photographic representation: as the numinous, as the miraculous, and as the sacramental. In each case, we will see that the connection between the photographic image and its subject is not necessarily as close, and that the difficulty with photographing the religious lies with whether we can confidently take the image for the subject it gives. Oh. So the first contender, or a first candidate for a photography of the religious, is the religious considered under the rubric of the numinous. For Rudolf Otto, the numinous occurs whenever we are in the presence of an overpowering, quote, an overpowering absolute mind of some kind, both objective, wholly other, and wholly mysterious. The numinous strikes in us a distinctive dread or terrifying awe, which also coincides with a certain fascination for what positively exceeds us. C.S. Lewis has described the particularity of this dread by contrasting it with a fear for what some power might do to you. The numinous, he argues, is rather awakened by what the object of fear is. Now, inspired by Otto, Gerardus van der Leeuw has highlighted some of the ways in which the plastic arts communicate the numinous. For example, by evoking dazzling sunlight, or by means of darkness and semi-darkness, as in the interior of Gothic churches, which signal that the divine dwells in an impenetrable light. Let's say by means of representing the divine in threatening majesty, as it can oftentimes be the case in iconographic representation, right? Also, and I like this as a possibility of understanding the numinous in the arts, we see some artistic representations exploring the ghastly or the ghostly as a way of drawing our attention to the holiness of the represented subject. And certainly Matthias Grunewald's crucifixion offers this, okay? Or also another image I was thinking this connection was the following Man of Sorrows by Angelico. There is something that stops us cold when we look at the image, and that brings us, or makes us reflect on our own state in this passion. And also, lastly, for van der Leeuw, there is a communication of the human and the divine, together with an overlap between the beautiful and the sacred, such as in the representation of the person of Christ, that does give us an approximation of the numinous. Okay. I do not take this list to be exhaustive, but already it illustrates the artistic representation of the numinous, in particular its tendency to depart from the mere realistic representation of things and its move towards a contrast or else a coincidence of opposites. By comparison, the numinous in photography tends to reduce to the uncanny, such as in some of Eugene Atget's desolate shots of the city of Paris, or as in old daguerreotypes whose stiffness are somewhat eerie. So back in the day of daguerreotypes, you were asked to stay put in a fixed position for anywhere between a minute and 5 minutes, and of course the impossibility of doing so meant that the print would appear somewhat blurry at some points, and when you look at it, it can be a bit disquieting. Okay, so these are representations or photographic representations of the uncanny, but these do not readily communicate the religious as luminous. Still, one may think of photographs of great religious artworks which already convey the numinous, such as Robert Kupka's remarkable photographs of Michelangelo's Pieta when it was on tour in New York back in the 60s. Also, one may think of further photographic possibilities, such as this photograph by Lajos Kerestes, taken in Lake Titicaca, and it is clearly a photograph of a sculpture, not of somebody actually crucified. But the photograph has such a reality effect that, of course, it makes you hesitate. It makes you wonder: is this actually a crucified person, actually the feet of Christ. So in that sense, perhaps photography does approach a little bit the expression of the numinous. Lastly, in the photographic representation of modern day saints, so saints that lived since the onset of photography, one could read, of course always a posteriori, some of that remarkable tension, say, between light and darkness, or between innocence and severity. Two examples that come to mind. On the one hand, this portrait of Saint Faustina Kowalska, a Polish nun who had a very intense mystical experiences with the Lord, and who wrote her diary, starting up the tradition of Divine Mercy. If you were to, I haven't done this, but if you were to compare this image, for example, with the image that she said that the Lord asked of her to commission, namely the image of the Divine Mercy, you would also encounter in that representation that strong contrast between the darkness, the enveloping darkness, and the light that comes or that radiates from the Lord. And when I look at a photograph, when we hear other people looking at these photographs, they also sense that, but of course they read it a posteriori. It is no positive evidence. Okay, that's one example. Another example that I have for you was this photograph of Saint Jacinta Marto. She was one of the three shepherds who saw Our Lady appear to her in Fatima. And in nearly all of her photographs, the ones that we have of her, in all of them, she appears bitter. She just looks severe. She has a severe look. This is perhaps the most toned down. But so for somebody who already takes on faith the fact that she did see Our Lady, and that she's stuck for the remainder of her life on this earth, her severity or her harshness does bespeak or does express that numinous encounter. Okay. It is fairly clear that the many facets of the numinous are not as intensely found in photography as in the plastic arts. Still, cases such as photographs of holy people elicit not only a photographic play of imagination, but also require a regard that seeks to already see by faith something that the mere depiction does not unequivocally reveal, namely grace at work with nature. Naturally, the holiness that a photograph conveys is no evidence, and in order to manifest the presence of that grace, some symbolization is still needed, as when the devotional card of a newly canonized saint, based on photographs, still receives a kind of halo. My example of that, probably the most photographed man of his day and age, right? But still, in order to make this a devotional image, some symbolization of the halo needs to be presented. Okay, good. So some suggestions of how perhaps the photographs approximate the numinous on a far more toned down level. Okay, a second suggestion or contender for the photography of the religious considers the latter under the rubric of the miraculous. Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church defines miracles significantly different from David Hume as signs of wonder, quote, such as healing or the control of nature, which can only be attributed to the divine power, end quote. As Daniel Gronowski points out, there is a surprising affinity between photographs and the Christian tradition of miraculous images called akarophorieta, or not made by the hand, such as the Mendelium, the veil of the Veronica, and the Turin shroud. These images are not just imprints made by contact, but images made by that contact. When Secondo Pia first photographed the shroud in 1898, he discovered that the shroud's image was itself a perfect negative of a man with closed eyes showing the peculiar signs of martyrdom that faith believes to be those of Christ. He went on to claim that for this reason photography had actually yielded the portrait of Jesus. Okay, so moving now within the scope of Catholic Christianity, and I believe also Orthodox Christianity, we run into different kinds of overlap between images and the miraculous. Okay, we run into miraculously made images. So these aforementioned akeropoieta, miraculous images, images through which God grants special favors. That's the second way. And thirdly, images depicting a miraculous event. Now, with the advent of photography, there have also been rare pictures, to be told, depicting a miraculous event witnessed by others. Very rare. As one example, I have the one from the Marian apparition of Our Lady in Zaytun, Egypt in 1968, an apparition that has not been discredited either by any Christian denomination. One may also find scant records of miraculously made photographs in the sense of pictures depicting a religious subject that was not visible in the first place, such as Father George Webby's picture or photograph taken outside the walls of the monastery of Saint Charbel. The photograph, once developed, unexplainably included the image of a man who was not present at the scene, this man, and whom the contemporaries of Saint Charbel, who were still living in the 1950s, recognized as the same man. And so apparently it is this image that has also molded the iconography of the saint, at least in Catholic worship. Okay. However, not only skeptics, I think, but also laity and clergy tend to respond to these photographs with remarkable apprehension. Why? It is as if the photograph, with its reality effect, precisely invited questions about the veracity of what it depicts, where the photograph in question has been doctored or stems from a double exposure or simply grasps an illusory form. None of these issues emerge when praying with a painted or carved image, not even with one of purportedly miraculous origin, right? I can more easily pray to Our Lady of Guadalupe than I can to the depiction of Saint Charbel in the photograph. It is as if my intention indeed was able to reach the image subject unproblematically, whereas in the photograph all sorts of objections arise. Okay, none of these issues emerge when praying with a painted or carved image. In other words, such photographs which purport to give either what is rarely visible or else what was otherwise invisible polarize viewers who see completely different subjects given by the image. For one spectator, this will be a photograph of Saint Charbel, whereas for another, a photograph will give a perceptual illusion. Without the requisite act of faith, even a photograph purporting to reveal the invisible or else the exceptionally visible will not give that real subject. This morning, while looking up for some visual expressions, I did come across, for example, but I'm not including it in this show, a picture taken in Mecca representing the shadow of a horse above the shrine in Mecca. And as a non-Islamic believer, I could not bring about that act of faith of saying, okay, maybe this was indeed something religious appearing. I could more easily think of, okay, maybe this is a balloon, maybe this is a sophisticated drone, maybe somebody threw a horse up, somehow catapulted, and that's how it appeared. Like I could really think of all sorts of other situations Maybe at the very bottom of my list would be, okay, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But I could not straightforwardly say, oh, okay, this was a representation of something miraculous. So definitely the photograph in and of itself introduces quite a few problems. And then third, and my last item, or contender for an analysis of a photography of the religious, considers the holy under the rubric of the sacramental. Okay. Now, according to the traditional formula, the sacraments are efficacious signs of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the Church. Of the seven sacraments or mysteries of the Church, the Eucharist is the sacrament of sacraments in which Christ himself becomes substantially present. We cannot enter here into the manifold levels of manifestation, presence, and absence in the Eucharist, though we're indebted to Robert Sokolowski, the American phenomenologist, who has proposed a theology of disclosure or a phenomenological theology. I will just say this about him, though. Amongst others, Sokolowski differentiates the Eucharist from either a mere representation of the Last Supper or of the crucifixion, even if the Eucharist does have an element of representation. Sokolowski also distinguishes the Eucharist from either a mere repetition or even a natural reenactment of these events, marveling at how the Eucharist is still the one sacrifice of Christ, and how every Eucharistic celebration both is and is not new, quote, in the way, analogously, that a picture both is and is not other to what it depicts, and a quotation both is and is not a new statement, end quote. So there's a similarity between the Eucharist as a sacrament and indeed the way images work, but of course there's also a major divergence. All sacraments in general involve layers of public disclosures and concealment, though at different levels. A baptism and a wedding celebration may have a public layer for which photographs are desirable, but also in each sacrament there is a non-public layer and a degree of intimacy for which photography or else plainly written records are not desired. This is also true of the Eucharist. Now, Bruff, commenting on Sokolowski, proffers that, quote, in the Mass, the spiritual action of God through his Son becomes public, intersubjective, in a sacramental way, end quote. But the photography of the Eucharist does reveal the limitations of that publicity. For example, one's reception of the Blessed Sacrament may be a public and seen event, but a religious believer might be displeased at seeing a photograph of the moment in which she receives the precious body and blood. She might describe such a photograph as intrusive, even if a photograph of herself consuming anything else would not, and even though the photograph of her communion does not purportedly reveal the body and blood of Jesus, but only the visible aspects of unleavened bread and wine. If this is the case, then, so if the photography does not reveal the mysteries, how come that it is bothersome? If photography indeed only captured the mundane and the materially perceived, such a photography would not be potentially distressing for a believer, just like a photograph of one's own infant baptism. Also, and unlike the photography of the miraculous, the cause of anxiety or of bother is not that something other than the visible and supernatural is unexplainably displayed. The photograph displays what was once actually and publicly visible, but for the believer, this photograph still displays something religious and intimate, her reception of the body and blood of Christ. It is not just, ponder about this, it is not just that the photograph fails to do justice to this reception, it is almost as if the photograph did an injustice here, not in the sense that a photograph does not reveal the body and blood of Christ as such, but in the sense that for the spectator, a photograph first turns the receiver's earnest reception into a pose, and secondly, in that the photograph portrays as past, an encounter that for the believer cannot be just past, but veritably bursts through the dikes of time and streams into eternity. In short, we still have here a minimal photography of the religious event as religious, but this photography may strike one as inappropriate, for the photograph submits the reception of the Blessed Sacrament of life and of Christ's triumph over death into an unwitting vain rehearsal of death. Some of these perplexities return when we consider the photography of Eucharistic adoration, but now maybe I should just ask a question of time. Are we?
Yeah, we have 7 minutes left.
7 minutes, okay, then maybe I should just briefly summarize my conclusion and what your appetite to read it at another time. So photography is not as convincing or as suitable as a way of representing the divine, but in my reading of it, it is not impossible. So there's a difference between saying that it is unsuitable for the purpose of prayer. It is something else to say that it is simply not possible at all. I think that if it was not at all possible to represent photographically a religious subject, we would not be bothered by it. But the fact is that there are some situations where it can interrupt the act of faith. So there can be, and I would argue for a sort of minimal photography of the religious. But the reason why that is important, ultimately, for my paper is because it reveals the necessity of a metaphoric move of the imagination in the believer who prays with images. When I look at an icon, in this case, I can identify who is represented and how. I can identify Jesus, Mary, the saints. I have a picture of the event, but the icon, of course, has departed from reality. It's not giving us a realistic representation of the event. It doesn't want us to be distracted by realism. It rather wants to express a divine reality concretely, okay? Which is different. A photograph might distract us and might produce problems for the believer when he only wants to experience the presence of the image subject and pray to it. When putting or making a comparison between a photograph of the Eucharist and a photographic or an artist's representation, even a representation like this, a believer will more likely prefer this one, even though it is not realistic, as opposed to a mere photograph of the Blessed Sacrament, because in this representation, you already begin to see what you already believe by faith, okay? So what is important for religious representation as such, and for the religious believer, is to be able to already intimate in an image what he believes by faith. That's the point that I'm getting to. And it does not necessarily turn the image into a symbol. The icon, at least using Husserlian terminology, is not a symbol for an event. It is not a symbol for invisible realities. It already manifests them, right? It already presents them and brings them to us, which is why an icon could participate in liturgy and be a religious representation, and not just a representation about the religious. Okay, so that's ultimately where I'm heading to, and I thank you kindly for having come along with me. Yes?
I have a question. So many interesting things in your presentation, so thank you. I like taking photographs myself, and I'm always quite frustrated because I can never quite capture the quality of the light, for example. So that strikes me as very important, right? This trying to capture something in its fullness and not being able to. And yet, when I look back at photographs, I always remember that I must bring the imagination in to the vision of the photograph. So I think in an art and in photography, we must remember to always bring our imagination to it.
Yes.
So even though I think the photograph in some way tricks us into thinking we're seeing something exactly as it was,
Yes.
when you participate in photography, you know that is never the case, because you can never fully capture something in a photograph as it was when you experienced it. So I think imagination is very central to this.
Yes.
And it's interesting, I liked your discussion of photography of subjects, because there's a philosophy of mind in play there, where we see a subject and we want to know who they are and how they feel from their face, from their posture. And part of my work is looking at photographs of ancestors and trying to understand ourselves through these photographs of people that we feel we're related to in some way, and yet there's always this philosophy of mind trick, or you can't really access who those people are from that image of the object. You try to understand their subjectivity, but it's quite impossible to do so.
That's a very interesting situation when you look at photographs of your ancestors and you try to find yourself or something of yourself in them. It's like that English expression that I've heard now and then. I remember when you were just a look in your mother's eyes. And you're sort of like, oh wow, is that where I began?
And just with people as well, of course, when we're with people in person, there's so much more that we intake, the kind of the emotional expression, everything nonverbal that we perceive but we do not communicate or even fully understand, I think, consciously. And that is the tension perhaps here, and it's just, your presentation made me think of all these interesting things. I could go on. So I don't think I have a question necessarily, but I'm thinking about imagination and bringing imagination to photography.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes?
I actually have a question about the artificiality in photograph. Because at a certain time, I worked for a photo art gallery, and I met a lot of photographers. Some of them consider themselves as artists, but others actually consider themselves just as, they don't consider themselves as artists, but more like a technician. Because the difference between, let's say, an oil painting and a photograph is that it's so easy to fabricate an image by using softwares like Photoshop, right? Like the artist I encountered, he told me that I am not an artist. Sometimes I piece up all the images I have just to give the audience something phenomenal.
Okay.
But behind it, is there an idea? I don't have it. But I just know how to piece up things to give this phenomenon effect. And when I heard that, I was so surprised, because I look at his photo. Of course, it has been processed. There is a lot of artificiality in that.
Right.
And because he somehow, we look at the eyes, it's Penelope Cruz, but somehow like the other parts is not the same actress, but some other from some other models. He just pieced up things together, and then he asked us if we think this photo is beautiful, and our first action is yes. A reaction is yes, and then he asked us who we think this model is, and we all say Penelope Cruz. And then he was like, no, it's wrong. It's not her. I just pieced up all the parts to produce this new image. But then somehow it is really beautiful, but it's not beautiful in an authentic sense, but in a very artificial sense. I feel like there is always a tension in photographs between artificiality and authenticity. So I am wondering like how this tension plays out in photograph, because something religious is always something transcendent, right? Like it's not just what is presented to us, but we can get afterwards. It could be something that's really authentic, right? Like, but it could be also something that's really artificial.
So that's the paradox, that the latter part of the question, that's the paradox, that photographs purport to give us things just as they appear, but the accessibility of something to photography, Husserl would say, is just as pretentious as the accessibility of perceptual things to us. we are, it is a pretense in the sense that it is not exhausted. Perception does not exhaust its objectivity. Photography also does not exhaust the objectivity that it presents. So there are limitations there. And the debate between the artistic and other uses of photography, whether photography itself is an art, is a debate that is still very much alive and kicking. You read defenders of photography as art, and you read people like Roger Scruton, who is very adamant about the fact that photography cannot rise up to the level of art because, in his view, photography does not really use representation. Whether every one of us taking a selfie with a camera rise up to the level of an artist, I do not know. But I'm just going to say something very short, very curious. Some photographers will will name the prime characteristic of their vision, the prime characteristic of their art as a photographic vision. They are able to look at things photographically. They are able to see that these will make a great shot, and then they take it. And that's not an ability that is universally shared. They are able to see it. They have a photographic imagination before they take the photograph. And even though the way that the photographs are filmed is very automatic, there's still the puzzling fact that for some great photographers, you know that it was them who took it. You can have two people with similar equipment taking the same photograph, basically, but one will be a salgado. And it will definitely stand out, and the other one won't be that. So there's, it's just worth pondering how far the human element can go, even into the mechanism of photography.
Just a short question. Do you think that photography also may have, under certain circumstances, an iconic quality?
Under certain circumstances.
Yes.
Oh.
You distinguish an icon
Yes.
and photographs.
I would say yes, but I'm fully aware that in saying so, I'm opening a can of worms, because I could not say this for every photograph, and I could not demand others to agree with me that every photograph has this character. Roland Barthes, to me, is the source here, because he spoke about how a photograph can reframe itself through what calls the punctum. So surely a photograph seems pretty dead, but the moment I begin to interact with it, and there is something in it that I cannot quite grasp or put a finger to, somehow the ineffable in a photograph, right? Something that draws me into it, the photograph can gain life. And can okay, but not in a Hollywood-esque sense of, oh my gosh, it's coming up. No. But there's something about it that really prickles me, and that exceeds my grasp. So, but that cannot be expected of other subjects to also respond to the punctum in a photograph as I do, whereas of an icon or of a religious representation, it is different, because that which we believe by faith is already present, made publicly available.
Yeah, icon speaks to you, but it doesn't have to speak to a Buddhist, for example.
But it is still it is shared by many more subjects of the same creed or faith or stance, whereas the punctum in an image which deframes it is only private. I know that it only works for me. What prickles me in an image might not be the same that prickles you.
Like if there was a very, very speaking, picture of the nature, something really, mist or fog or something, to someone it can have this iconic manifestation of some kind of divine aspect. Efficacy, I think.
Actually, that I showed one shot, the one from Arket. It just made me wonder. if I can go back to it in just a second, whether it would not steer somebody coming from the East and remind him of Chinese or Japanese representation where the void or the nothing is, and the white is just as important, if not even more important than what actually appears or catches form. Okay.
Yeah, it's very interesting that I actually had this a question going in the same direction, and because we are positioned this way in the room, that the situation for me is somehow in evidence of tangibility of thought, or the phenomenal quality of presence of qualia in cognition. But I wanted to say also about icons, or ask you a question. Icon is an object. It's not just a representation, because it's an object of material expression of religion, and as an object it requires lots of making, while icon is a snapshot or photograph. I take it quickly, right? This is there is craft in the process, in the process of revelation of an image. It's nearly hypostatic.
Absolutely. There's
just because it's not randomly.
There's almost like extremes in a horizon, with the icon being a work of prayer, basically from the moment that you go into the woods to find the piece of wood. Yes.
Exactly.
So it's not comparable.
So I was just thinking about the aspect of materiality and the constitution of space. I think that we may be facing a different constitution there.
Thank you. One though with at least one surprising point of continuity, okay, that I would like to bring to your consideration. In the Orthodox rite, icons are more venerated by touch, right, by kiss,
as well
than
yeah.
So it's not just a primacy of the visible; it is also the contact. And some people studying icons, like Paul Moyart, who try to view icons in a different way than Jean-Luc Marion, have considered at least the way that we also in a secular environment use photographs. For example, I carry photographs of my family in my wallet, not because I look at them, but because I feel that with them there is a kind of contact, a form of tangibility with the ones from whom I took the photograph. So there is the importance of both icons and photographs can exceed the visible in the direction of the tangibility of both. But again, that goes a little beyond my present story.
Maybe stop by Doug Adams' gallery, Louchakova-Schwartz. We have here the whole gallery, which works actually, and a specialist in the institute who works with icon art. It would be great.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah.